Hello and welcome to our third quarterly meeting of the International Western Music Association Kansas chapter. This is Lunch and Learn, and our special guest today is one of our own, Ron Wilson, to talk to us about what's going on with the cattle trails and other things. Ron?
Thanks, Martha. I'm going to share my screen and show some PowerPoint slides in a minute, but let me do this very informal show of hands. Who here, raise your hand, has heard of Lewis and Clark? All right. Who here has heard of the Oregon Trail? Who here has heard of the Santa Fe Trail? Who here has heard of the Pony Express? Who here has heard of the Chisholm Trail? Who here has heard of the Western Trail? Not unanimous. Who here has heard of the Great Western Trail? Couple of hands. This all relates to the trails history and the upcoming National Cattle Trails Conference and the Red Steagall Cowboy Weekend. So let me attempt to share here. All right. You see a screen that has the IWMA Kansas logo?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to share some background. I'm not sure. I think this will be informative. I'm not sure how helpful it will be, but and I can very easily get off into the weeds on this. But this is the context of where we are today. That the legend of the cowboy originated along the cattle trails, that recent legislation has been introduced to designate two of the cattle trails as National Historic Trails, and that legislation has been stymied. Okay, so that's where we are. So let me go through the background here. I would argue that the cowboy culture as we know it really originated in the post-Civil War era of the big cattle drives where Texas Longhorns were moved north by young men on horseback to railheads in Kansas. And that's what would become glamorized by dime novel writers and then Hollywood and so forth, and connects to the cowboy culture of today. So the cowboy, the history of the West is fundamentally linked to that. In modern time, in the 2000 teens, legislation was introduced to designate the Chisholm and Western Trails as National Historic Trails. So let me go through the background on that. In the first place, to become a National Historic Trail, only Congress can designate a National Historic Trail. It literally takes an act of Congress to make that happen. And it's happened a number of times in our era and in our region. So you can see the trails and the years that they were designated. So some of those trails have been designated for a long, long time. One of the things I've come to learn is the difference in the trails. The Lewis and Clark Trail was a trail of exploration, of course. The Oregon and California trails were trails of immigration. There were people moving west. The Santa Fe Trail was primarily a trail of commerce. It was trade goods moving back and forth between Mexico and frontier outposts in Kansas City. And then the Pony Express Trail, of course, was a trail of communication. They were simply carrying the mail, carrying messages back and forth along the western half of the continent. So these were important trails. Each of them had valuable place in our history, but they were not cattle trails. The cattle trails were unique in the sense that they were moving cattle typically one way to market or to some other use. And those trails have never, ever been designated by Congress as National Historic Trails. There's really, I don't know, I would say there's four prominent cattle trail systems from that era. The Shawnee, which was largely before the Civil War, the Chisholm Trail, Western/Great Western Trail, and the Goodnight Loving Trail to the west. And popular culture. On the TV show Rawhide, what was the destination that they were trying to move the cattle to? Where was the town that they were trying to move those cattle to?
Sedalia, Missouri.
Sedalia, Missouri. And in, Lonesome Dove, it's essentially a goodnight loving trail story. So those are the 4 trail systems, and there's a whole lot. It's a whole lot more complicated than that. But of those, to me, the 2 most prominent, maybe, are the Chisholm Trail and the Western and / Great Western Trail. And note that I have a slash there, and I have the term Great Western Trail. So in the 2000 teens, really beginning 2009, there was an effort to have these cattle trails designated. The 150th anniversary of the Chisholm was coming up in 2017. And so these groups pushed for a feasibility study, legislation to do a feasibility study to study these trails and whether they could be feasibly designated as National Historic Trails. And that legislation passed Congress, and the National Park Service then was working on this feasibility study. And the feasibility study was released officially in 2019, and they had a couple of findings. Excuse me. One of the findings was that the cattle trails were indeed real, that they met all of the criteria for National Historic Trails. Not only were they authentic, but they had real value. And, why was it that the Prairie Rose Wranglers and whoever it was so popular at Carnegie Hall and in the Great Wall of China? Is because there's global fascination with the cowboy of the cowboy culture of the Americans. And so, and so that was a key finding. The other finding of the National Park Service that was relevant here had to do with the names of the trail. Now, it turns out that in the 1960s, there was a graduate student at Texas Tech who wrote a research about this history, and he used the term Great Western Trail to describe the trail to the west. Now, if you look at that map, of course, the trail on the right is the Chisholm Trail from South Texas to Abilene and Ellsworth. And then the trail to the west was creatively called the Western Trail. It's about as imaginative as calling your black horse Blackie, right? Because clearly it was the trail to the west. But this grad student wrote about the Great Western Trail, and the advocates in the communities along that Western Trail thought Great Western had a ring to it. And so they formed the Great Western Cattle Trail Association and promoted the Great Western Trail. Well, the National Park Service studied this whole thing and said the most historically correct names really were the Chisholm Trail and the Western Trail. So that feasibility study was forwarded to Congress. Kansas legislators primarily, then put that into the form of draft legislation that would designate the trails as Chisholm and Western Trails. Well, the Great Western Cattle Trail Association felt totally betrayed by this, that their name was lost in this. And so while we were sending letters to our members of Congress saying to support this legislation, they were sending letters to their members of Congress saying don't support this legislation. And so the result was it went nowhere, that the legislation was stymied. Legislators on issues like this, they just want to keep everybody happy. And so when they get conflicting opinions, they don't do anything. In fact, they said to us, once you get your act together, let us know, and then we'll work on it. And then in addition to all this, the Biden administration put forward an initiative called 30 by 30, which was a proposal that by the year 2030, 30% of American land would be in some conservationist use. And that was interpreted to mean this could become a federal land grab. And then it was interpreted to mean, oh, well, if Congress designates this, then that could become under federal control. Just the exact opposite of what we've intended, by the way. And so it became a political mess. And the legislation has been stymied. So what did we do? Well, the leaders of these trail organizations came to recognize that there's a whole lot more that unites us than divides us. We may argue about names, we may argue about scope, we may argue about routes, but in the end, we care deeply about Western history and the culture of the cowboy. And so, just a year ago, in Dodge City at the annual conference of the Chisholm and Western Trail Associations, this joint letter of support for a cattle trails consortium, a unified consortium of the multiple cattle trails, was signed. And the just to excerpt the last couple of sentences, we are united in the belief that the history of these trails has great value to our nation. We pledge to jointly work together to promote and preserve the valuable history of these cattle trails for the benefit of our communities and future generations. And it was signed by representatives of the Goodnight Loving Trail, the Western Trail, the Great Western Trail, the Chisholm Trail, and the Shawnee Trail. And so we had this letter of support, this effort at unanimity among the trail associations. And so as we work with our partners north and south, really the credit for this goes to the folks in Texas. A guy named Bob Saul, who he and his wife usually are at IWMA in Albuquerque. Expect they'll be there this year. He's a publisher, and he's the new president, actually, of the Great Western Cattle Trail Association. And he and his crew have taken this on and really ramped it up to a very high level. And so since that time, the Historic Cattle Trails Consortium, HCTC, has been officially incorporated thanks to Bob and his crew in Texas. Officers have been elected, and somehow I've been elected as president of this group. We have a series of programs, a Zoom each month called Cattle Trails Showcase, free to anyone. And each month we highlight different attractions along the cattle trails. So it's a museum, it's a historical element, it's a speaker, whatever it is. A lot of museums and that highlight different aspects of the trails along the various cattle trails. Started really with the Chisholm. Now the Cattle Trails Consortium is doing that. Another thing, a special edition Celebrating the West magazine has been produced with information on each trail. There are 10,000 copies. It's a beautiful magazine, and that's being distributed in the central states. And then the first ever National Cattle Trails Conference has been planned and is upcoming. Here's a picture of the cover of the Celebrating the West magazine. It's a gorgeous magazine and has extensive information about each trail in Western history. Cattle Trails Showcase. This is the monthly showcase that we've been doing for several years now, highlighting attractions along the Western Trail. And, you know, frankly, the philosophy is we may or may not get a federal designation for these trails. We're not waiting for the government. We're going to promote these trails from the grassroots up ourselves. If you're interested in viewing Cattle Trails Showcase, these are archived and on YouTube. But if you want to get the monthly notice about these trails, excuse me, there's an email there for Nancy Lawrence, girlofks@gmail.com. You can send her an email with Cattle Trails Showcase in the subject line, and she'll make sure that you get the notice of each month's showcase, which we hold on the second Friday of each month at 10 a.m. So that's another project of the HCTC. And then the National Cattle Trails Conference is actually this week, and I'll be driving to Texas here on Thursday for that conference on October 24 and 25. Again, great credit to the folks in Texas. Bob Saul and his crew and those on their team in Texas have put together an outstanding program, in my view. We worked on the calendar, found the date that would work to do this in Cleburne, which is just south of Fort Worth, and settled on this weekend, only to find that it's the very same weekend as the Red Stegall Cowboy Gathering in Fort Worth at the Stockyards. So that'll be going on this very same weekend. So our people will be able to take part in the conference and then take part in the Cowboy Gathering. in the stockyards, separate tickets. So the people will have to get online and do that. But Red Steagall has done this for a number of years, apparently. There's a bunch of stuff: Ranch Rodeo, Western Swing Festival, Cowboy Music and Poetry. There's Chuck Wagon Competition, Cowboy Church on Sunday. And so there's it's going to be a really fun weekend with the Red Steagall Cowboy Gathering and the first ever National Cattle Trails Conference. And I wanted to share one other thing, if I may. And that is the website for the conference, complete with the agenda. So historiccattletrails.com is the website. And they've put together a really excellent program, in my opinion. Friday morning, this is all this Friday now, we'll have a working session with the associations and work through goals for what we might do working together going forward. The Texas Secretary of Agriculture will be speaking. We'll have speakers about the cattle kingdom, Shawnee Trail, the Texas Longhorn, the original Texas Longhorn, the genetically pure original strain of Texas Longhorns are near extinction. The Longhorn cattle have proliferated. Breeders are breeding these cattle with these enormously long horns, but the original ones are down to like 2,000 head. Tribute to the drovers and so forth. People can go participate in the Red Steagall weekend. And there will be Chuck Wagon breakfast and Chuck Wagon lunch on both days. Saturday we'll have some legislators and historians speaking. And then Michael Martin Murphy will be recognized and will be speaking on Saturday morning there in Cleburne. This takes place at the Outdoor Chisholm Trail Museum in Cleburne. And then again, lunch provided, and we'll have opportunity to go participate in the Red Steagall Cowboy Gathering in Fort Worth. Sedalia, Missouri has agreed to host the 2026 National Cattle Trails Conference. So you can be watching for info on that. And just make one last comment. We had a contact from Congressman Ron Estes just this last week. And he had been a lead sponsor on the legislation to designate the Chisholm and Western Trails, because the Chisholm Trail cuts right through his congressional district and through South Central Kansas. His staff came to us and said that they would like to do a resolution to honor the history of the cowboy in conjunction with America 250. So 2026 will be the semiquincentennial, the 250th anniversary of the founding of the U.S. As of July 4, 1776, signing the Declaration of Independence anyway. And so there'll be a big celebration in 2026. And he said we should promote the history of the cowboy as part of that 250th celebration. And I think it's an inspired idea. And my hope was that we could all get behind a resolution that would acknowledge the multiple cattle trails, not just the Chisholm, and acknowledge the different names that existed at different times and places, and all support a congressional resolution that would honor the history of the cowboy and the cowboy's role in America's 250 years. So we hope to discuss that at the Cattle Trails Conference this week. With that, Martha, be glad to take any questions or try to. And Jeff, you've been very close to this in a whole lot of ways. Anything you'd add?
No, you got it. I'm not familiar with that. What was that magazine you showed us?
Celebrating the West is basically a new magazine that Bob Saul's organization is publishing.
Okay, that's a new one to me. So,
Now, where do you get it?
Well, I was afraid somebody was going to ask me that. It's not a subscription magazine, I don't believe. I think they're distributing it through Western wear stores and agribusinesses. I wish I knew the answer to that. But I'm trying to remember if Cavender's, for example, or any of those were advertisers and they would have copies in their stores. I'll see what I can learn. If I learn something further, I can let you all know.
and what's the date of Sedalia in 26?
Has not been set. I presume fall of 2026.
Ron, that was fascinating information. Could you send me your PowerPoint? I think the recording will get the PowerPoint, but just in case it only is showing you, if you could send that to me, I'll make that available to people too. That was really interesting. So that's sad that legislation got stalled.
Well, there are a whole lot of circumstances that had to do with it. And,
Yeah.
a lot of it we probably did to ourselves, arguing among ourselves about names and details. And we're still not past all that. But I think we are at the point, I think, to say going forward, what can we do? A resolution such as Congressman Estes has proposed, that's not taking anybody's property rights. It's purely a positive recognition of authentic history. And
Right.
so
No, I think that's a really good idea. Really good idea. We'd like to welcome Scott Wiswell and Jim Winters to our merry band. Does anybody else have other questions for Ron? Well, I just want to thank you, Ron. Well, and congratulations for being president of another fine organization.
another unpaid job, as you know.
Exactly, exactly.